Chasing the Mind, podcast number 14, Ship of Ghouls with Nicole Neitzel. Welcome to Chasing the Mind, hosted by Dr. Angela Johnson and Dr. Stephanie Schwartz, the podcast that explores the art and science of the mind. Each episode, we will feature a topic or guest who offers a unique perspective in answering the following questions. How do our thoughts influence our sense of who we are? How do we impact the world around us? And can changing our minds change everything? Today on Chasing the Mind, Dr. Angela and Dr. Stephanie interview Nicole Neitzel, art historian and preservationist.
But that childhood, just pure joy of, I know about this and now I'm here and seeing it and experiencing it, I still feel that about buildings.
But first, what makes us afraid? And why do we love stories about things that go bump in the night?
What about the ghosts?
Oh, I knew this was coming. I knew this was coming. All right.
It is October, and of course that means Halloween is coming up. And with Halloween comes spooky, scary stories. Today we have an incredibly special guest, Nicole Neitzel, who had the amazing experience of working on the Queen Mary restoration. One of the interesting things that came up during our conversation with Nicole was about
ghosts.
Ghosts, exactly. Ghosts, because apparently the Queen Mary is haunted. It's one of the most haunted places in the world, supposedly.
And that ghost is one of the most evil ghosts because it steals battery power.
Oh, that's right. Yes. So that's a good story. But it got us thinking about
Halloween
and fear and why we like to be scared so much. Why do we like to be scared?
I don't like to be scared.
Yeah, I don't either. First of all, I guess when you're thinking about why people want to be scared, I guess it depends on how they're going to be scared, right?
Definitely true.
I mean, I think that's, especially this time of year, there's every kind of horror film out. And hi, Barkley. I often wonder if those movies are about scaring people as much as they are about grossing them out.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between that. And I've never been a big one for being scared, but I used to not be as easily grossed out as I am now. And I don't know why it's changed so much, but there's certain things. Cough, I'm looking at you, Gotham. Cough. I literally can't watch anymore, like especially while eating.
Yeah, there's a number of shows I haven't been able to get through because I feel like they've just tried to push the envelope in terms of what grotesque thing is allowed. But even beyond that, like I was never one of those people who liked, things jumping out at me in the middle of the night, scary stories where you had some sort of ghosty thing who's haunting you. Like, I just never liked any of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the difference between people who like horror versus people who don't, the people who like ghosty things versus those who don't, really an interesting area of study.
From what I understand, there's different theories of, why we like to be scared as a species. I mean, supposedly we've been jumping out of caves at each other since, we were living in caves. But we certainly do know that we have a body that responds to, fright in terms of its fight or flight, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And so when you have that jolt or that fear, it releases things like adrenaline and dopamine. And some people really love that experience of being flooded with those kinds of, neurotransmitters. I personally, it makes me want to throw up.
One of the early theories about introversion versus extroversion was about stimulus-seeking versus non-stimulus-seeking people. and the idea that people who are extroverted or stimulus seeking actually sort of live at a lower level of nervous system activation, and that those people seek stimuli like spicy food or frequent interaction with others or roller coasters because they feel like their nervous system needs more activation. Introverts would be the opposite.
It's funny because just doing even a little bit of research on this, it goes to show you that you know, no matter what study you look at, I can think of 5 people who don't fit that study. You know, so as you're talking, one of the people I know who absolutely adores horror and scary movies is my sister-in-law, who's actually kind of a big introvert. And I'm thinking, that's really interesting. Whereas I'm probably more on the extroverted side of the scale, and I just am not at all interested.
Same with me. I know people that are much more introverted than I am that prefer horror movies or scary movies much more than I do. People actually often refuse to see scary movies with me because I insist on holding people's hands during the scary parts. I really don't like things jumping out at me in a movie. I really don't like that. And I used to play the piano when I was younger, and so my hands are very strong. So when I squeeze people's hands, I often really hurt them.
I've been on the receiving end of some of that hold my hand stuff during a movie that you thought was going to be scary, and I can attest that, yes, you have very strong hands.
Yeah, so there's starting to be a longer and longer list of people who won't see a scary movie. Or they're like, well, we'll see it with you, but I'm sitting way over here.
Yeah, and so another thing I was thinking about was the idea that maybe some people like scary movies because they're able to distance themselves. They're sort of able to sort of hold themselves back from the plot of what's going on. But then I wonder, like, can you really, you know, be truly scared of the events that happen? Because I'm like the opposite. I'm one of those people that if I'm reading a scary story or I see a scary movie or I'm seeing a scary television show or something, like I get really into it to the point that I'm still thinking about it the day after, 2 weeks after, 3 days after, you know, like forever. And it like is traumatizing.
I'm the same. I get very, very immersed in whatever's going on.
And yet I know people who are the same way. They love to get immersed in a story. They love to just lose themselves in that. And they still love that thrill of being scared, jumping, having that adrenaline rush that I guess comes from that. And maybe they're able to, when they walk out of the theater, go, whew, that was fun. And then just sort of shake it off.
And there's several different types of, you know, we talked about gross out, kind of scary versus things jumping out at you. There's one TV show I watched this year. I watched a lot of, okay, we'll edit that in, but it's about clones. But anyways, a lot of they talked a lot when I looked at the sort of interviews about it. They talked a lot about body integrity and the fear of not having control over one's own body, things being implanted, things like that. What the heck is the name of that show? It's with Tatiana Maslany.
I can't help you. Well, the other interesting thing when I was reading about fear, sensation seeking for things like roller coasters, right? So, and that's funny because I actually love roller coasters. I'm fine with that. Although as I've gotten older, I'm a little more sensitive to motion. But I was looking at the origins of roller coasters, which apparently was in Russia, where they would go down icy hills in sleds in the mid 17th century.
That is crazy to me. You were telling me about this and I was like, they had the beginnings of roller coasters in the 1600s?
Yeah, and they would call them these like dark rides or something. And so, I mean, I'm sure they were like pretty dangerous if you're going down a hill on a sled in icy weather. It's probably not the safest thing, you know, but I mean, through every generation, there's been some sort of, you know, thing that we've used to either gross out ourselves or scare ourselves. Haunted houses, House of Horrors, P.T. Barnum and his, you know, wacky people.
Well, right. I mean, those human oddities, the bearded lady, the really small people, the actual first set of Siamese twins, Chang and Eng. I don't know. Do people find that sort of thing actually scary, disturbing, something to laugh at, or do they laugh at it because they find it disturbing?
I think that's what's interesting is it's all kind of mixed up. Horror, disgust, fear, all of it kind of gets mixed up in our little primitive brains, you know, because I mean, obviously if you go in and you look at someone who, you know, has some sort of thing going on that's kind of like, oh, that's really odd and horrifying to me, you know, that's not going to happen to you per se. Whereas, you know, if you go and watch a crime drama that has particularly frightening, you know, mass murderers, for instance, like people love hearing about mass murderers and psychopaths and serial killers and all that stuff. And I wonder about like, what is that? Is that just like the it's not going to happen to me, or it's just really scary, but it's outside, so it's okay? I don't know.
Yeah, you were telling me that some of the most popular podcasts are ones that have to do with psychopaths and
true crime.
Yeah.
True crime is like the biggest thing in podcasting, apparently. And
I don't know if TV's just gotten grosser. I think it has, but I definitely have noticed that things gross me out that used to not bother me. Maybe it's because I know that bad things can happen to you in a way that when I was younger, maybe I felt more invincible. I'm not sure. By the way, the name of the TV show is Orphan Black. If anyone wants to edit that back in, meaningful look at co-host, Orphan Black.
Orphan Black. Okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
Nicole, welcome to Chasing the Mind. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
You said that you were 7 years old when you became fascinated by ocean liners.
Yeah, that's right. I can remember the moment very well, actually. My friend was looking at this picture of an iceberg, and I was like, what are you looking at? And she told me all about the Titanic, and I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. I looked into it more, and I realized that a lot of the passengers were residents of Newport, Rhode Island, where my family vacations every year. So those two obsessions just kind of fed into each other. And I never really stopped studying, history, and ocean liners were always kind of in the background. There's not a ton of professional study on ocean liners. There's some books, and there's a lot of books on art. It's not something like Van Gogh that has thousands of books written on it. So I never really thought of it as a sort of professional angle until I was in my master's degree, and I chose for my final paper to write about architecture and ocean liners. They used some of the same designers that buildings on land did, but, on a ship you have no right angles and things are totally different and you have different goals, especially in some of the early 20th century ocean liners. You're trying to look like a French palace, and you have to do that on a ship that's floating and no windows and that sort of thing. So I thought that was interesting.
I just want to back up for one quick second because I'm finding myself wondering, at the age of 7, your friend shows you a picture of the iceberg and tells you about the Titanic, and you're immediately fascinated. So can you tell us, what did you find enchanting or fascinating or interesting about that?
I think especially as a kid, I sort of thought it was interesting because of the sort of human folly element of it, with the whole, the ship is unsinkable, and then what does it do? It, doesn't even make its first crossing because it sinks. And then as a kid, the same things that fascinates adults, over 100 years later are the same things that fascinated me. The, stories of the band playing till the ship sank, and, of Ida Strauss staying with her husband rather than going on a lifeboat, and those sort of human stories that you hear in any disaster. But I think because the Titanic was it was a ship, so it was all by itself. It was, an independent sort of thing happening. There are, concrete number of people involved. So you have a concrete number of stories, but there's so many stories and they're all very relatable. And one thing that actually I didn't realize until just now, when I do historical research, especially for fun on my own time, I love to look into topics that are often sort of overlooked, like third-class passengers and, poor people and, oppressed groups and those kinds of things, because I always feel like their stories are kind of like a guest star in the story of the, rich people and the leaders and so on.
So these sort of overlooked stories really speak to you.
I think as a kid, I just wanted to know everything I could possibly know, and it seemed like a lot longer ago than it does to me now that I've studied all different historical periods.
When you were reading some of these stories, are there certain ones that stand out for you that you remember?
I remember reading about them as a kid, and, you're imagining all these ladies in their beautiful gowns and that sort of thing, and then the next day they're in their pajamas, basically, trying to decide whether it's safer to stay on the unsinkable ship or go in the little tiny rickety lifeboat. And it kind of makes sense why a lot of them were hesitant. Think about that, and I both want to go, you idiot, get on the lifeboat or you're gonna die. But I also want to be like, I don't know what I would do, because they thought they were infallible. They thought they were in a safe place. And I think that's something that can kind of translate to a lot of concerns where people are like, do I go to the new job or do I stay at the old one? I know how it works.
So you're fascinated with the Titanic. How does that then carry you to the next phase of pursuing this as part of your career?
I stayed interested in all sorts of history throughout my entire childhood and middle school and high school, and everyone was like, oh, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be an art teacher, I want to be a scientist, whatever. And I was like, I have no idea. I don't want to be a history teacher, but I really love history. Mm-hmm. And which is kind of funny because now I want to be a professor someday. But nonetheless, at the time, I didn't want to be a history teacher, and I had no idea what to do about that. So I was looking in one of those admissions book where they were like, please come to our school for Salve, and they had historic preservation, and I said to myself, that's probably taking care of the mansions or something. I'll go to that school. And thank God I was right. I remember sitting in my first preservation class, and the teacher was nerding out about replacement windows and vinyl siding, and I was just sort of like, I found my people. Every time I took a course on a different topic or a related topic, I did archaeology and anthropology and architectural history, and I don't even remember some of the names of the courses, but I just got more interested and more interested. Actually, my advisor in college, I thought everything she talked about was so fascinating, and I looked up, what her degree was, and she was an architectural historian, and I was in love with buildings, so it kind of made sense. And then, once I wasn't a freshman anymore, I realized, no, that really is still what I'm interested in. And I ended up going to the University of Virginia, which I believe the only school that calls architectural history rather than having it as a subset of art history, which is why I decided to go there, because they really were all about architectural history. In my classes, I didn't really do this intentionally, but I sort of always ended up sort of being on the outskirts of the topics. Like, for instance, I took an arts and crafts class, and I was the only person who wrote about the colonial revival, which is parts of the arts and crafts movement, but it's sort of on the later end. Like, I did my undergraduate thesis, and almost everyone did it on some topic related to the 1700s, and I did mid-century modernism and that sort of thing. And that's actually how I ended up writing the paper about ocean liners, is because, of course, everyone was picking buildings on land, and I was like, I'm going to do a building on the ocean. And because it was my first opportunity to really look at ocean liners in an academic way. Mm-hmm. And so I did that, and then I didn't really think about it again for a while. I decided not to make it my thesis topic, which was a really difficult decision. But I couldn't let go of this other idea I had about postcards. As one of my jobs while I was a student, I cataloged a whole bunch of postcards, and I stopped every postcard, and I was like, look at this, look at this. And my coworkers were like, okay, Nicole, we have to get our stuff done. And I just didn't want to give that topic up. So I wrote about the history of tourism and how postcards sort of fit into that, and how the representation of buildings, what that might have meant to people and that sort of thing. And then I was graduating and I was looking at all sorts of different avenues. I knew I wanted to sort of go in a museum direction. So I checked out what the Peabody Essex Museum had because that was pretty close to my home. And they just so happened to have a maritime art and history internship on ocean liners exhibit that they were going to be having. And I jumped at the chance. So I was so excited when they called me back and they picked me. And I just enjoyed being at work every day.
So what did you do then?
I did a variety of things. I helped them with some foundational research, the basic organizing of files and that sort of thing for different ships. I helped them create a list of ships that they'd be interested in finding objects from. I looked through auction catalogs and museum catalogs and online databases and things like that for objects that had ocean liner provenance, might be accessible for the exhibition and just sort of any sort of research project that they needed. So I got a wide variety of topics within the greater topic of ocean liners from that project, which was really cool.
Well, maybe now's a good time for you to talk a little bit about what it means to be an ocean liner, because I think people are kind of maybe more familiar with the idea of like a cruise ship, but an ocean liner is kind of a different animal.
Yeah. So an ocean liner is specifically a ship that would travel from one place to another, transporting people. So they would call it like for instance, there was one that was, for Fall River, that I believe went to Newport, if I remember correctly. And it was called the Fall River Line. That was a small one. Then you have these gigantic behemoths like the Titanic and the Queen Mary that were traveling all the way across the Atlantic from, England and France to America and back. And those are sort of like classic image that people get of ocean liners that, had thousands of passengers. When you didn't have airplanes, it was the way to go. And actually, one of the reasons that ocean liners sort of transformed into cruise ships is because of air travel. When people could, if they were just trying to get somewhere, they could do it in hours instead of days. They did that. But if they wanted to go on a ship for the enjoyment of it, they would still go on a ship, and they'd sort of transitioned to what the need was. And that's why we sort of have these mega cruise ships that we have today, because they're all about joy and enjoying yourself.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned sort of transportation through these huge ocean liners. That's actually how my mother came to this country. In 1950, she was 5 years old, and I honestly can't remember what ship she was on. I have the name Lusitania in my mind, but I'm not sure.
That sunk in the 19-teens, so it's not that
so
one.
No, I'm just remembering
I mean, that ship sinking was a huge deal. It was actually used a lot in propaganda for convincing people that America should join the war in Europe. So it's a pretty notable example. So don't blame yourself.
Yeah,
I knew it was important, but anyways, my point was that my mother came to this country on a ship whose name I cannot remember, and she's going to be mad because I actually asked her what it was, and she told me in the past couple of weeks.
We can edit that in, right?
Sorry, Mom. But actually, she remembers crossing from France to the U.S. and at one point, and we're going to get into this in a little bit, you did some work with the Queen Mary, but at one point she remembers the ship captain saying, "Okay, everyone, look off the starboard side, because way off in the distance you can see the Queen Mary. We're passing in the opposite direction." So
that's very cool.
I mean, it's interesting that she has such a striking memory from age 5, but yeah,
ocean
so
liner travel was a big deal.
Yeah, that's how
for
she
a lot
came
of
here.
people. It might have even been their only vacation they ever took because they were immigrating, relocating, that sort of thing. So I can understand why she might remember that.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool. I'd love to chat with her someday.
So tell us a little bit about your transition from your internship and how you ended up doing architectural preservation with the Queen Mary.
I'm working on this ocean liner exhibit project for my for the Peabody Essex Museum, and I serendipitously got an email from my advisor from graduate school saying that the Queen Mary, which is a ocean liner that got turned into a hotel in Long Beach, California, is a firm was looking for someone to go through the ship that was an architectural historian and, catalog it and that sort of thing. And I was like, oh my goodness, I have more than one credential for this because I worked on ocean liner projects because I was in the middle of one. And I'm an architectural historian. So I emailed them right away. They got right back to me and they were like, come on over, we're going to do this. And I was so thrilled, even just thinking about it. Not to get too sappy, but I remember when I finally got to go to the actual ship itself for the first time. And my coworkers were like, is she okay back there? Because I'm like hyperventilating because I can see the funnels. And I'm like, oh my God, it's really in front of me.
Can you tell us just an overview of the history of the Queen Mary?
So the Queen Mary was an ocean liner that was built in the early 1930s. It's famous for its Art Deco style, which is considered sort of to be the golden age of ocean liners. It was built to be a passenger liner to take people back and forth between England and America. Given the timing of its maiden voyage, which was either 1936 or 1937, I have to double check that. But it was right before World War II. So pretty quickly it got turned into a troop ship. It was painted gray to kind of hide it from the enemy rather than the bright black and red ship, and it was referred to as the Grey Ghost, which I think is a cute nickname. And it did that for several years. It also, when the war was over, brought back army brides was the term, where it brought back all of the soldiers and the women that they were maybe marrying or already married to America and Canada. Then after that, it got turned back into a passenger liner, and it was in service until the mid-60s when between the fact that it was getting quite old and air travel was really taking over, the Cunard Line decided to sell it, and they brought it to Long Beach to be converted into a tourist attraction. And it's considered very iconic in Long Beach. If I remember correctly, it's even in their city seal. There's actually a little drawing of the Queen Mary. So when I researched the ship, I sort of divided it into those four chunks that I kind of just described. The initial construction, the World War II era, the sort of post-World War II era until it was retired, and then the Long Beach era. So it's actually been in Long Beach almost as long as it was a passenger liner, so it's a pretty significant amount of time.
And I've actually had brunch there. Listeners may know that
So it's a successful tourist attraction.
It is. It is quite successful. It's sort of somehow paired with the Spruce Goose, which is a plane that Howard Hughes owned. And in fact, before we started looking into this for the podcast, I thought they were somehow both briefly owned by Howard Hughes, but no. The Queen Mary was never owned by Howard Hughes.
He was weird, but,
he was weird, but not that weird. But yeah, at one point my grandmother retired to an assisted living facility in Long Beach, and I remember once we went to take her to brunch on the Queen Mary.
That's
and
very
it was
sweet.
Very grand. I think this was like in the either 80s, late 80s, this was in the 1990s.
I believe they got rid of the Spruce Goose in 1993 or 1996, so if that was there when you were there, then that sounds about right.
Yeah. My memory for dates in general, I was not a history major. So dates, not my thing.
I won't lie. Even though I am a very good historian, I pretty much always have to double check dates.
Tell us about the process of architectural history when you're working with something like the Queen Mary.
So for this project specifically, we went through the ship and we were our end goal was to create a document that assessed the current condition of the ship and its architecture, as well as some decorative arts and furnishings, and talk about its condition and how best to preserve it, make preservation recommendations, sort of assess the different spaces. And after we did a little preliminary research, our first step was to create a database of the architecture and objects in the ship, and I nerded out and got very specific.
Were there aspects of the architecture and items on the ship that reflected the various uses and various periods?
Oh, absolutely. Honestly, for me, that was kind of the funnest part, was to go into a room and be like, okay, well, that was put in when it was owned by Disney, and that was put in World War II, and that was, that's definitely from the initial construction, because I've seen that in the, shipbuilder, that object. For the record, the shipbuilder was a publication put out by the Cunard Line about their new ship and talking about how great it was and all the features. This phenomenal resource. But anyways, what we sort of did is when we went into each space, we analyzed individual objects and features by sort of trying to figure out what belongs to what period.
Well, I guess what's kind of confusing to me, not knowing anything about how this works, is, like you said, this ship was built in the 30s. It served one purpose, then it did something else in the war. And then, by the time you get to the 60s, you've got completely different style. And so how do you, as someone coming in the 2000s, decide what is worth preserving and not preserving, and how do you make those decisions?
Yeah, so that's a really complicated question.
I like those kinds of questions.
No, and I love talking about this because I could probably have this question could probably have its own podcast if I had my way. But when you think about significance of an object or a space, there's a lot of ways to look at it. A lot of people, especially people who aren't preservationists, and I don't blame them, I'm not talking down or anything, but will look at something and think that if it's not original, it's not necessarily significant. And anything is more complicated than that, but I think especially with the Queen Mary, because it had, designated periods of change. When you think about significance, those things from World War II, such as, ship navigation equipment, say, in the bridge, that is not original, but it is still very significant because an extremely important part of this ship's history was the fact that it was a troop ship. And it probably wouldn't have necessarily had that piece of equipment in there if it wasn't. Then you have some renovations and that sort of thing when it was converted back into a passenger liner. And those are just as significant too, because that's what someone who traveled on the ship in the 60s is going to remember. It's you have to kind of go on a piece by piece basis, and that's why they brought me in, basically. Me and my coworker, we spent a lot of time sort of talking about this topic and thinking about those things. One example that I might use for this sort of idea of significance is there's a lot of plastic on the ship, a lot of it, and I just nerd out about it so much. I love it. A lot of people, they hear plastic and they go, ooh, cheap, ooh, not great, and expensive, ooh, maybe we could replace that with some metal. But this plastic was very similar to Bakelite. It was called Roanoid. It was an early plastic. The Roanoid was the trade name, and it was considered the height of luxury in the early 20th century because it was new, it was shiny, it was fashionable, it was, still moderately uncommon compared to, we think of today and everything is plastic. It didn't sort of have that ubiquitous reputation that it does now. And when you maybe would go into the ship without any knowledge of the history of Roanoid, you'd be like, oh, there's a lot of plastic handles in here, whatever, and then move on with your day. But if those handles weren't there, the room would look a lot different. You wouldn't necessarily know why it looked different, but it would be missing a key feature that makes it the 1930s ocean liner that it is, because that material was so significant. So why did I start talking about this?
No, I totally get it, because I actually am a big fan of Bakelite.
I saw your eyebrows go up when I said that.
Oh, I was like, Bakelite? Really? And there's a lot of jewelry that's made out of it. Mm-hmm. A lot of sort of decorative pieces, like you were saying, handles and stuff.
Yep. Purses, all sorts of stuff.
Purse handles. There was a lot of like fabric purses with purse handles, and you can like buy the
early
purse
plastics
handles.
Are so fascinating.
They are. And Dr. Angela's like sitting here going, who knew? Early plastics. Celluloid kind of things that were not particularly safe. Actually, when you said Roanoid and it has the same ending, I'm like, was that flammable?
I could talk about celluloid in the Queen Mary if you want me to.
Sure.
My favorite room in the whole ship is actually one that's not accessible to the public, which makes me so sad. I wish that could be something that is a thing, but between money and tight spaces and all that sort of other things, I don't think that's in the immediate future at the very least. But It's the projection room. So the Queen Mary had a projection room, and it was so that they could, show movies and that sort of thing on the ship while it was traveling as entertainment. But, as you mentioned, plastic materials like celluloid were very flammable, so the nitrate film was unbelievably flammable, and the whole room was just designed around what's going to happen if it spontaneously ignites.
Wow.
It's amazing. There were some of the stuff has been removed, like the cameras and that sort of thing, but in the room you can still see, where the many fire extinguishers once were. And there are little windows so that the projector can, project out of the projection room and onto the screen. And those windows weren't just, a little piece of glass or anything. There was the projection window that was glass and wood, but then in front of that was a metal door that if you flipped the handle, all of these doors would go down, and they created a seal so that the fire wouldn't spread outside of this room. And then the doors sort of were double doors. So you'd have the door that sort of worked similarly to the little tiny doors for the projection windows that I just mentioned, where it would create a seal behind you. And then you'd have the, normal door for the getting in and out of the room. So when you let those doors down, you got out as quick as you can, and you
shut
just
the door behind you.
Yep, and you just let it burn. Luckily, this never happened, of course. But the theory behind it was that hopefully you can get out, and then the whole ship won't go down with it. But it was a huge fear in sort of film spaces in general, because even now preserving nitrate films is pretty. People are very conscious of the fact that it's a very flammable material. But when you're on a ship and a fire can lead to the entire ship going down real quick. It was such a concern. It was just such a fascinating space to be in.
Interesting. All this planning, but they're like, but we will have movies, darn it.
Well, it was a luxurious ship. You had to have the newest and greatest things. And
we aren't going to have
by the 30s
tap dancers.
Yep.
Tap dancers don't normally ignite, but we're going to have movies.
Yep. By the 30s, if you didn't have movies, it was probably going to be kind of disappointing. So.
Well, and what's interesting in what you're describing is that part of what you're doing with these objects is you're telling the story of the life of the people who were there and what they were experiencing when they were in that little room and what they were thinking about and what the people who were trying to show the movie were thinking about. I think that's sort of the difference when you think about restoring things or like you said, making everything original or whatever. That's not the whole story. So part of what you're doing is telling this story from beginning to end, and that includes all these different little points along the way.
There's actually a term in historic preservation called acquired significance. It's usually talking about buildings and that sort of thing. But so if you have a house that was built in 1720, and then in 1840s they put the beautiful Gothic porch on it, the Gothic Revival porch on it. So now it's 2000 and something. That Gothic porch may not be, quote, original, but it's however long old, and it represents what the people who lived in that house wanted for their house at that time. So it sort of gains its own significance as part of the story of the house. I think that was how I sort of looked at, the pieces from the period where it was a troop ship were no less important than what was installed in the 1930s. And, something installed in the 1950s was still important because it was part of the life of the ship and part of the story of all of the people who took trips on it and worked on it.
Well, that's interesting because that's part of how you were talking about the house we're sitting in when Dr. Angela gave you a tour and said, this piece here is original and this piece here isn't. And you were like, yeah, but it's still interesting.
Yep. I can't really turn off my historian. It's not a thing. So,
how do you deal with the aesthetic of it, though? I guess that's because we were talking before. It's like this idea of oh, well, things may be significant, but they might not be attractive. So, as a historian, how do you think about that? Or is that a conflict that comes up?
That is a really complicated question because...
Another one.
Yeah, no. My favorite answer. I think it depends on what object you're talking about or what feature you're talking about and how ugly is it? Is it just that you think it's ugly or is it terribly made and about to fall down because they only used one nail in the first place? Is it from 2 years ago or 200 years ago? It's a very item by item basis on how you sort of think about that concept.
Well, I think you used an example we were talking about, when there's weathering, for instance, that sort of tells you something about an object. So there's distinctions in the wall because there's different kinds of weathering that occurs. And how someone coming in might be like, oh, well, we should fix that. And your response was something like, no, because that tells us something about what was going on or what was happening at the time.
I think what you're talking about is when I mentioned there were, in one of the spaces in the ship, there was what used to be a shop. So there was a lot of drawers. It was haberdashery. So there was, shoes and ties and that sort of thing. So there were a lot of small drawers in the space. And if you just come in and stick your head in and then walk out, you're going to be like, wow, none of those drawers match. That's a real mess in there. But then you actually stare at those drawers and you realize that, they're different colors because possibly they're exposed to different amounts of light. There was something in front of this one and something in front of that one for 10 years in the 80s and that sort of thing. So it changes it, but actually all of the drawers were from the same period. It had its original hardware. And were you to refinish those drawers to have the stain match, you could possibly destroy the veneer. And the veneer, especially on the Queen Mary, is really important because somebody once referred to it as the Ship of Beautiful Woods because it had countless different types of different veneers and different woods that were used throughout the ship. Some of them don't even exist anymore because the trees have gone extinct.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Honestly, I would love to do my own research project just on the wood on the ship. So, and veneer, that's another example of how you have to sort of look at things differently. Veneer is important anywhere because it makes the object what it is. But it's super important in the Queen Mary because the veneers and the woods used were part of the ship's identity, both as a historic object, but also at the time. So that's really something you don't want to mess with if you can remotely avoid it.
Yeah, see, I'm a biology nerd, so I'm immediately like, I bet the tree geneticists want to get in there and look at those extinct
that would
trees.
Be so cool.
And maybe, a la Jurassic Park, maybe try and bring those trees back.
That'd probably be a much more boring movie where they sit on an island.
Oh no, the tree's growing 1 centimeter a year.
I actually...
Jurassic Tree. Hey listeners, I hope you're enjoying this interview that we had with Nicole. It was fabulous. And I will tell you that we laughed a ton during this couple of hours that we spent with Nicole. And in fact, even though the interview is about an hour, there was a whole after show that was so fun and so funny. And my goal is to get that extended interview up on our Patreon page by Monday. So if you're enjoying this interview and you want to hear more, go over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/chasingthemind. And right now, for a pledge of any amount, a monthly pledge of $1, $2, anything you want to give, you can get access to our extended interviews, posts that we've put up there. We're going to be offering some Google Hangout opportunities coming up in the next couple of months. Dr. Stephanie and I really want to grow this community and interact with you, our listeners. On that note, we have just started a Facebook page called Mind Chasers. So if you want to interact, hang out, talk about the topics we address on the shows, ask questions, whatever it is, come on over to the Facebook page and join us. I want to get back to our interview, but before that, I have to let you know one other amazing thing. Dr. Stephanie and I got to be guests on the Something Random podcast, where we hung out with Charles, Scotty, Joel, Michael, and we had such a good time. That episode is actually up right now. Again, it's the Something Random podcast, and there will be a link to that episode in our show notes. And coming up soon, we're going to have our episode of where we interviewed the guys, and we talked about movies and their movie that they made, their short film. We diagnosed it. And we also did a little diagnosis of the guys based on a special psychological test we developed just for them. Anyway, here's a little promo for them, and then we're going to get right back to Nicole. Talk to you soon.
Welcome to the Something Random podcast, where sometimes we talk about movies, sometimes we talk about television, but we always talk about something random. I'm your host, Charles.
And I'm your co-host, Michael.
I'm Scotty.
My name is Joel.
Okay, so what we do in the podcast is we answer questions from our audience like...
What would Batman sound like if he was played by Tom Hanks?
Okay, Joel, go.
I gotta go get the Penguin and Catwoman. In my Batmobile.
All right, and at the end of the episode, we make original movies. Ideas for movies. Go.
Apollo 1776.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so the idea here is they go into outer space, they come back, they're back in time,
And they crack the Liberty Bell. Oh, no.
those astronauts. Womp womp. You can find our podcast wherever podcasts are found, and we hope that you have a wonderful week.
See, I'm a biology nerd, so I'm immediately like, I bet the tree geneticists want to get in there and look at those extinct
That would
trees.
be so cool.
And maybe, a la Jurassic Park, maybe try and bring those trees back. I actually...
Jurassic Tree. With Dr. Schwartz.
But in all seriousness, I'm enough of a nerd that I would love to sit there and watch someone do that.
Okay,
do the actual research, not the Jurassic
I
Tree
should
part.
mention at this point that I did spend a summer on a screenwriting internship, and I probably would not have greenlighted the project that I just thought of.
No, you would not.
I would not have done that. Well,
Mutant trees.
But if anyone does want to greenlight it, apparently you'll be willing to write the script.
I might, actually.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, extinct tree veneer. Come on, who's excited with me? Moving on, says Dr. Angela. I see it in her eyes.
I'm going to ask this question. I told Dr. Stephanie I wasn't going to preview it with you, so I wanted to get your honest reaction.
Oh boy.
What about the ghosts?
Oh, I knew this was coming. I knew this was coming. All right. So, full disclosure, I do not believe in ghosts, but when you put me in a room in an old mansion and it's nighttime and I'm by myself, I leave the TV on so I don't hear any creepy noises. So I'm a skeptic, but I'm not. So I'm on the Queen Mary the whole time and I'm thinking to myself, well, I'll keep an open mind. You never know. At the very least, I can observe what people think are ghosts, maybe.
Because we should say there's this whole thing about the Queen Mary, that it's the most haunted.
Yes, it's often on
ever.
lists of, most haunted hotels, most haunted such and such site. So there's a huge aura around it.
And you were there for like a year, so.
Almost, yeah. So, and before I even left, people were like, tell me if there's any ghosts. So that's why I knew this question was coming. So, I tried to keep an open mind, at least in the sense of, if I observe something that someone perceives to be a ghost, maybe I can be like, okay, well, no, that's because such and such is degrading. Anyways, so my one ghost story from the Queen Mary.
Ooh.
Is a pretty boring one, but there's the first class pool that is accessible to the public only through ghost tours. The room is in pretty poor condition. It's very sad. When the ship was brought to Long Beach to be converted, it was a whole debacle where they didn't choose maritime architects. They chose land-based architects, and that's all well and good, except for the fact that the Queen Mary has, no right angles. It's an ocean liner. Everything's curved. Everything is fitting into something else. They removed the boilers from the boiler room that was underneath the pool. And my understanding is that the boilers were not just functional. They also sort of held up the ship because they're these huge metal boilers. And I guess some of them were at least partially load bearing. And so the whole room is just sort of going like, I don't even know how to describe it. I just kind of go.
It's curving inwards?
It's a little bit. Very slowly. It's been decades. It's not going to collapse tomorrow, hopefully. So because of that, the tiles are not really on the wall right, and the sort of things are crooked and that sort of thing. And it's a little bit of a creepy room, even without the reputation of ghosts waiting for you. And then you add to that the lighting isn't really great because it's a room for ghost tours. So they don't really prioritize fixing the lights in the room and that sort of thing. It adds to the creepiness. I get it. But we had to be in there to do our architectural historian thing. And it was pretty dark, and it was kind of frustrating, but, you know, we did what we could. Our equipment included 2 cameras and 2 tablets, and we charged them every night. And I know for a fact that I charged them that night. But we were like 10 minutes in, and one of the tablets is like 50% battery, and we're like, what the heck? And, you know, and then our camera batteries were kind of not working so great. And so we're like pretty much plugged into the wall. I can see your face. It's going where you think it's going. So it's plugged into the wall in order to type on the tablets, and we're like alternating charging the cameras, and it was so frustrating, and we're just like, this is ridiculous. So we're thinking something's wrong with the camera or whatever, who knows. We're doing our best. We're documenting the room. You know, we're taking the pictures we can with and without flash and so on. And while we're doing this, the ghost tours are coming through every, you know, hour, and I'm doing my best to ignore them because I'm trying to focus on my work. And, you know, my coworker, you know, I don't know, she, I guess, kind of listened, kind of didn't, like me. And so I totally didn't hear the last tour that went through, but my coworker did. And she was like, okay, it's only 10 minutes early. I think we should just leave. And I was like, okay. So we leave, and she tells me in the car that one of the stories that the tour guide was telling is how in that room, their batteries don't last, phones don't work. It's not a power of suggestion thing because we had that experience and then heard the story. So that's the best I got for a ghost story. I'm sorry if it's disappointing.
No, that does sound kind of creepy. I thought you were going to tell us that they like told the tour people that you were ghosts. They're taking an oddly corporeal shape today. Look at them.
That would have been fun. They would have been like,
but-
look at this girl in her chucks and her sweatshirt. Like, very 1940s.
And why are they doing accounting?
They seem confused by modern technology.
We probably did look confused. But yeah, no, you know, people coming out of mirrors or any of that crazy stuff. Or not,
But you heard
any
the
of that
stories.
silly stuff.
You heard the stories.
Well, and in the pool, too, there's also supposedly, like, wet footprints and
Oh,
people
yeah, none of
walking
that.
by the pool.
And let me tell you, we had one of the times we had to be in the pool, we were in an area that doesn't have any lighting anymore, which is the changing rooms. And I won't lie, that was a little creepy. So we had our flashlights and everything, you know, and that's where there's supposedly wet footprints and this and that and salt water and stuff. And, you know, we didn't, obviously it was just a normal work day. So sorry if that's boring.
So you're not completely convinced that it's haunted, but you're not gonna like volunteer to spend the night in the swimming room either.
I feel like that's a good way to put it. Yeah. You know, I'm not going to go say it's haunted because I think that does a disservice to the actual history of the ship and all of the wonderful things that are available for people to see. But I'm also not going to blame people for sharing the fun stories and looking at it that way. You know, I get it. I do.
Wow. I think it's like, this is sort of backing us up a little, but I think it's really interesting that you grew up in this area of New England and developed this interest in architecture. Mm-hmm. I grew up in California, and I never understood why people were interested in architecture.
Because nothing's really that old. There.
Yeah, I will say, I love mid-century modern architecture. I really do. But oh boy, after about 4 weeks in California, I was already like so sick of it because almost every building is mid-century modern because that's when there was a huge population explosion. You know, so
I mean, there's some great examples of things. Like there's, my mother for some reason
for
calls
sure.
it googie architecture, but there are these.
Okay, Nicole is making a face like she's vomited a little bit in her mouth.
That's not what that face meant. That face was more like, she knows what that is. That's what that face really was.
Oh, that's a word?
Yeah, it's like a sub-style of modernism. Yeah.
Is it like, it looks like Fred Flintstone?
I mean, that's not how I would describe it, but I can see why you would describe it as that, yeah.
Yeah, there were lots of, but anyways, I didn't understand people's interest in architecture until I went for my junior semester abroad in Scotland. And I was like, oh, like old buildings.
And like castles and stuff. Cool.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like, you know, oh, this thing has been here since the 1600s. It's not like, well, this one's been here since 1952, and this one's been here since 1954. So you can clearly see the evolution. And in fact, fact, I was abroad in
The sad part is I would say something like that and be serious.
I could believe it. Like Charles Rennie Mackintosh. I was in Glasgow for my study abroad, so there's some great architecture there. But I can see how growing up in New England, there's some great architecture here. So I see how that could have nurtured your interest.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. But actually, I don't know how to say this without making myself sound a little silly, but I'm going to embrace it.
We like silly here.
Part of it goes back to that 7-year-old Nicole who felt like, oh my God, the Titanic is so cool. Because
And it was before the movie.
Yes, before the movie. Everyone's always like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, the movie. Like, it's so popular. And I'm like, I don't want to be a hipster, but I'm like, excuse me. It was like 4 months before the movie was a thing. But anyways, so...
Oh, God, I'm so old.
No kidding.
So...
Anyways...
So I remember, doing my research with my little, books that my dad bought for me and that sort of thing. And, it mentioned people like John Jacob Astor and the Wideners. And I was like, why do I know these names? And I realized that, they owned mansions in Newport, which was somewhere that was really important to me. My family vacationed there. It was a second home to me. Even as 7, 8, 10, whatever years old, I was like, oh my God, I'm in their house right now. Like when I would go to the museums there or when I would drive by and I, figured out which houses were whose, I just sort of never let go of that. I love that feeling where, I know an artist and then I go see their piece of work and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm actually in front of this person's piece of art. Or, I read the book about this person and I'm in their house. And well, that sounded really creepy. But that childhood, just pure joy of, I know about this and now I'm here and seeing it and experiencing it. I still feel that about buildings, even as a professional and an academic. And I think that's why I love architecture so much, is because it's pretty, straight up. I'm going to be honest with you, it's pretty. But it's also, it tells you so much about what was important to people, what they were trying to say about themselves. And I think that's why I also really like furniture and decorative arts too, is because what you fill a building with is and is just as important as what you make it look like, because it's, what did people use? What did people need? And that actually is relevant to the Queen Mary too, because being a ship, a lot of it's things that, furniture were built in. This wasn't true on the Queen Mary, but this was true on other ocean liners where they had their dressers were magnetic topped so that the mirrors wouldn't slide off. That's a really important thing. That's not something you're going to find in a suburban American Foursquare. Never.
So if you could, with your magic wand and your wallet full of bazillions of dollars.
Oh, yes. Lots of that.
Pick the style, the home, the whatever, the period, the...
Oh, don't do this to me.
What would you pick? What would you do? What would you get?
I'm going to pretend like I don't already have an answer for that. I actually, when I was like a freshman in college or sophomore or something like that, my best friend and I, we would go and drive around Long Ocean Drive. It's this beautiful space, lots of mansions from the late 19th or 20th century, and beautiful ocean views and that sort of thing. And we would just talk about random junk. And one of the things we talked about is we designed, like you said, gazillions of dollars fictional mansion. Mine had the Yard of the Elms in Newport, but it was on the ocean instead of sort of inland, and had the library from Marble House, which is also sort of the same period, the late 19th century, earlier 20th century. And but I'd also have a wing off the side that was modernism, because you can't totally abandon that. I don't consider it my area of expertise, but for some reason my heart always just kind of go back to that sort of outlandish late 19th century sort of style where they were copying every single historical style they possibly could and just smushing it all together. Which I guess is kind of what this fictional mansion I'm talking about did, so maybe I'm not that far off, but I guess it'd probably end up looking like that, even if I tried to avoid it.
Well, Marble House was like copying Versailles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's kind of what that period was, which is
Dr.
copy one.
Angela, have you done the mansions in Newport?
I haven't actually. No. And it's funny
You
because
should go with me. You don't even have to pay the tour guide. No,
and
just
I learned so much. It's because I grew up in California too, primarily. And so, yeah, again, it was like the houses all look kind of the same or whatever. But when my husband and I started looking at houses, we would go look at Victorians. I just hated them. Oh my God, I hated them.
Oh, yeah, I totally get it.
Because, like, it's like 5 10 by 10 rooms that you can't put a TV on a wall because there's like no walls.
Yeah, they're
But
not
then-
conducive to modern life. They were
but
conducive
then,
to putting a lot of junk in and dark furniture.
Yeah.
That's what I think of when I think of like the, key Victorian era, like around the Civil War.
And I hate the gothic-y thing and the doilies and the red and all that. I don't do. But when we found this house, because it's a Queen Anne, so a little simpler, a little more open, a little more, like the flow of the house.
It's a little arts and crafts inspired, I noticed, but it's not, I wouldn't necessarily call it arts and crafts style. It's definitely more Queen Anne, but
Yeah, so I liked this, but it's just funny because when you say the whole thing about California, it just always reminds me of every episode of House Hunters in Southern California, and how somehow, no matter who you marry, one of you likes Spanish and the other one likes arts and crafts, and it's like you're destined to be doomed.
yeah, that show should be called like Divorce Court or something.
Seriously.
Divorce House.
But the people... Divorce House. yeah,
Divorce
people-
Hunters.
But it shows like that people are drawn and inspired by particular kinds of architecture, and then like that's just what they want, right? I have to have a Spanish home. I really want an arts and crafts, and then they fight the entire episode.
Well, that's why this fictional house that we were talking about, I would have all this, late 19th century style building, totally ostentatious and obnoxious, and then I'd probably put like a Mies van der Rohe chair in my front hall. You guys, do you know?
What did she say?
Mies van der Rohe?
Mies van der Rohe was a modernist architect, and he just did design some furniture. Very simple, very plain. The materials are the decoration, as opposed to, crazy Gothic doilies like you were talking about.
I'm just thinking about this show and how we have such a variety of guests. One of the things we get to is people's passions and who people are. And I have to just let people know, like when Nicole came into this house, she's like, oh my gosh, there's pocket doors.
I did do that.
There are pocket doors in this house. And we've had
Pocket doors in good condition, no less.
in working good condition. And we've had we've had some Skype interviews, but many of our interviews have been live with people in this house. And let me tell you, before today, not one has been like, pocket doors.
My husband had a little bit of a squee over the pocket doors when we walked through it the first time. So that was probably my doom for we're buying this house for pocket doors. But no, I mean, I have to say I dragged Nicole through the whole house to be like, okay, how much did I screw up with renovating and making it look kind of like it's supposed to? And she's like, well, a little bit, but
It looks like a late 19th century home that someone lived in the 21st century.
Somebody who likes steampunk.
and
brick.
And there'll be pictures of my kitchen up on the website, apparently.
Yeah, there's no mistaking that as an original part of the house,
and
but it's still beautiful.
And the pipe open shelf, that's totally a steampunk thing.
Yeah,
It's
funky and it's cool.
Engineered by our sound engineer, resident pumpkin chunker, and all around,
He's walking off.
he's walking away. As
I guess he didn't enjoy that pumpkin chunker.
He's a pumpkin chunker.
So actually the way that we know Nicole is a mutual friend told us about Nicole. She, our friend Jen, volunteered at the Franklin Historical Society, and you worked there as well.
Yeah, I worked for the Franklin History Museum. They are not just a nonprofit, they're no profit. They're part of the town, the Franklin Historical Commission. So they never had a paid employee, and they really wanted to bring somebody in who could, help increase the amount of objects that they have listed in their Perfect database for keeping track of their artifacts and, bring in preservation recommendations and work on projects and that sort of thing. And being a resident of Franklin, I was all about that because often do you get to work on something in your hometown and get paid for it, right? So I worked as a collections management person there for the summer, essentially, and with someone else. Her name was Allison. She focused on the clothing. There's a lot of clothing in that museum space, and I sort of focused on everything else, which was sort of stored in the basement. I sort of helped them get rid of a lot of the things that were just leftovers from previous uses of the building and narrow down what was actually part of the collection. And I learned a lot from them, and I think they learned a lot from me, and it was a really fun project. It was a really great summer, and I'm really happy I worked on that.
Were you at all involved in improving their social media presence?
Oh, I actually was. I created an Instagram for them, which was so much fun for me, because as I would go through the collection to sort of formalize it and make records for things, I'd sort of be like, oh, if you could only see the corner of this, you would know what it was. So I would post pictures every Friday, and I'd ask people to guess what it was. And of course, the museum's opening hours were on the weekend. So I would ask people to see if they could figure it out. And then I would post the answer on Monday, hoping that, a person or two would pop in the museum and try to figure out what it was and that sort of thing. So that was fun. And I also just posted things we were working on, events we had, and that was fun for me because it wasn't sort of part of the initial project, and I was like, please, can I do this? And they let me do it. So
even for people that didn't, go to the museum,
it still had the opportunity to learn something.
Yeah, I
wait, did you follow us?
Yes, on Facebook.
I didn't know that.
I sure
that's
did.
Awesome. Of course, I linked the Instagram and the Facebook. Because,
yeah.
duh.
And so it led to some interesting discussions because some people would say, what the heck is this? And people would start guessing, what is this object? There were also...
And it was so great because some people would be like, I used that in my 3rd grade class. And I think that was really great, not only from a, historical education perspective, but also from a, reminiscing and being part of Franklin's history perspective, because these people, they maybe don't see it as historic because to them it's their childhood, but it's actually kind of 60 years ago, so it's a little bit historic.
And passing things from generation to generation.
Yeah, and sometimes I didn't make too many of these posts because I was really trying to focus on things that I could provide information for. But other people in the museum were part of it, and they would say, well, I kind of know what this is, but I don't really know what this is. Like, I know where this picture is located, but do you know who's in it? And when we would get answers, from the people who followed the Facebook page and the Instagram page. So that, that increased our institution's knowledge. And, especially when we could verify those things, then we could put that in the information that was in the Past Perfect database. And, or we could do further research.
I'm going to say I really enjoyed the pictures of donkey baseball.
Donkey baseball is so much fun.
Tell us all, what is donkey baseball? And then the next question, of course, is why?
So I don't know the why. Okay, I'll be honest.
Nobody will ever know the why of donkey baseball.
But donkey baseball was basically just this weird thing that they decided to do. And so what they did was, instead of just playing baseball like normal people, you had to run the bases on the back of a donkey.
And what era was this?
If I remember correctly, it was the 30s-ish? Yeah, it was like the late 30s. The photographer was Stanley Chilson, who his profession was being a fire photographer in Franklin, so he would take pictures of disasters, nearby. But he would also take pictures of happy things too, and he documented a lot of things around town, and one of those included filming donkey baseball. And I remember when me and the volunteer I was working with, that was actually Jen, our mutual friend, we were looking into it, and we were watching this video, and I was just sort of like, wow, that looks fun and horrifying at the same time.
You heard it on Chasing the Mind. Folks, is your intramural baseball league just not quite exciting enough anymore? Add donkeys!
Oh my God.
Get all the hipsters on that
Here
one.
come the PETA letters.
Oh, no,
I don't think they were harsh to the donkeys. It didn't look...
Well, I know. I have a question. You keep talking.
I thought you were poking me because I was supposed to end and thank Nicole for helping us.
Not yet. No, I just have one more question. So if you have a dream project you'd like to work on?
Can I have 2 answers?
Sure.
My first answer is, in my heart, I would love to go back to the Queen Mary and continue, what I did there, perhaps in a different context. One of more, maybe with a final project being like a book or an exhibit or something like that, rather than a report. I think having that sort of different outlook would be something that I wouldn't mind revisiting, because we didn't even touch like a third of the ship in the, almost year that we were there, because it's just so big and there is so much in there. Sort of the other answer, I really loved my master's thesis, and I wrote about a collection of postcards and tourism, and I would love to do something that sort of expands upon that, something that's related to the history of tourism, because especially, in the late 19th and 20th centuries, tourism in America was a very unique thing. Our love affair with cars and the open road and national parks and all of that sort of thing. I would just love to keep researching that.
Well, Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been so enjoyable.
And very educational. Personally and as part of the podcast.
Definitely.
Well, thanks for having me. It was really special to be able to talk about a project that's near and dear to my heart and my career. So it's nice to be able to share that.
Thank you for listening to Chasing the Mind. Today's episode featured music from purpleplanet.com. Please visit our website at chasingthemind.com, where you can find links to topics mentioned on the show. And you can find our link to our Patreon page. Remember, for a monthly pledge of any amount, you can get access to the extended interviews as well as access to our monthly newsletter and sneak peeks and a behind-the-scenes look at the show. Chasing the Mind is intended to provide information and entertainment and is not intended to substitute for professional mental health assessment or treatment. The opinions expressed by the doctors and the guests are their own and do not reflect professional advice. Information offered by the doctors does not create a therapist-client relationship. Please seek professional help with a mental health treatment provider if needed.